Hello everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Analyzing Grey, featuring George Lucas. Now, the more I started to think about it, the more my perspective on George Lucas changed over time. George is a talented filmmaker and very inspired as a writer, but I also think he's prone to bad decisions, which may be reactive some of the time, but in other times they're of his own accord. Today we will look into my mixed perception of George Lucas, as while it is more positive than negative, there's still enough negative to warrant talking about. So let's begin. First, if you're new to this channel, all the rubbish around prequel hate is just that. Rubbish. The prequels are great films, and hated for very disingenuous reasons, ranging from Jar Jar to alleged racial stereotypes to alleged bad dialogue. Most of it is bad faith. So sorry that I don't live in the year 2012, but rather 2025 as of writing this video. With that being said, let's get into the positives. For one, George Lucas is a creative visionary. He created Star Wars and co-created Indiana Jones, two IPs I hold very dear. He came up with an impressive amount of crap off the top of his head, and as stupidly as people tried to discredit his contributions to Star Wars, being the creator and all, he is genuinely talented. I never agreed with the notion that George Lucas had a weakness as a writer. He's certainly no master at every aspect of filmmaking, but I think he excels at making movies, even if he's technically directed only 5 feature films. He has a directing style of picking actors who are exactly what he wants, so he hardly ever interrupts them during takes and lets them come up with their own personality for the characters based on the script. There's also the fact that people so grossly miss the point of what he was going for when they critique his work. For example, not understanding that Anakin was designed to be socially inept before ripping on his character and George because Anakin was socially inept. It comes from a preconceived misconception about Darth Vader being this badass all-powerful warlord, which is one of the biggest myths about Star Wars. So if that isn't a genuine problem with George Lucas, then what the hell is? So as a fan of all the Star Wars movies he made, I think the biggest problem George Lucas has is changing his mind. Usually George has a lack of commitment to what he previously made. It can manifest in negative ways, such as the Clone Wars 2008. He, after all, greenlit that show directly. Often as a defense, people pin a lot of the Clone Wars' retconny bad decisions on George. Now, whether George or Dave Filoni had more control is up for debate. However, in either perception about the Clone Wars' production, George doesn't come out looking very hot. If George had more control, I perceive the Clone Wars as a backtracking mess. If you look at how the Clone Wars approached the characters, the most blatant example of backtracking was Anakin Skywalker. Anakin Skywalker was pretty much designed to be the polar opposite of his film portrayal. Now, someone like me understood that Anakin Skywalker is not supposed to be a role model, and he never was. So making him this Han Solo type character with his dark moments fundamentally changes the story. As the central character in the Star Wars saga, changing his portrayal from unstable and moody to cool and suave, with a teeny tiny bit of darkness on the side, detracts from the message. Star Wars, after all, is mainly about one's choices, about being selfless versus selfish. Anakin decided to be selfish in his fall to the dark side, and it doomed himself and everyone around him. You're not supposed to see his dark or selfish choices as hip and cool. The dark side is horrible, and nothing good comes from it. And you shouldn't be empathizing with the Sith. Anakin's story, if anything, is a cautionary tale about one's choices. Too many people can't separate the evil as cool trope from morality. It's important to note that regardless of whether the villain has an evil as cool presence, you must not empathize with what they're doing, unless it's a story that's meant to question moral grays and whatnot. But in regards to Star Wars, what Anakin Skywalker turned Darth Vader does is wrong. It's not because we're told it's wrong, it's because one can piece together they are wrong. Choking your subordinates for failure is extremely petty and evil. Being an enforcer for a ruthless tyrannical government is oh so wrong. Darth Vader showed no empathy towards those who were supposed to be his allies. So that tangent aside, George Lucas backtracked on his own, extremely important message about one's choices. Portraying Anakin as this hip and cool dude will just misdirect people into thinking he's an idol we should worship, and that's not the case. George abandoned his own message just to quiet prequel haters. He couldn't stick to his guts and wavered under pressure. The pressure was great, I will admit, but it doesn't mean it's a good idea to go backwards. I imagine this pressure greatly influenced other decisions he made. Darth Maul's resurrection and Ahsoka's existence. Both were terrible afterthoughts made out of complete weakness. You might be telling me that I'm wrong about George here because he said this or that in an interview or behind the scenes featurette, but I don't think he's being entirely truthful or giving out the whole story. George is obviously not going to say publicly that a bunch of people vocally hated the prequels and that's why he tried to appease them. He'd more so talk about wanting to expand on the Clone Wars and wanting to do animation and other shit like that. It should be worth noting after all that what people say and when they say it matters a lot. I think a lot of pre-Last Jedi Backlash quotes are more reliable than post-Last Jedi Backlash quotes, for example. So with that being said, there are examples of George going back on his work that isn't based around prequel hate. Take Indiana Jones, for example, an entirely different franchise. Around a decade before Kingdom of the Crystal Skull even came out, he phased out old Indy played by George Hall when he repackaged the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles into the Adventures of Young Indiana Jones. Now, for the most part, I don't think George changing the special effects of his movies or adding scenes matters at all, especially since the original message and themes were left intact, perhaps adjusted to account for the prequels, but aside from that, it was for better continuity rather than something that fundamentally changed the story. But like George Hall, that meant phasing out a lot of actors. While Sebastian Shaw, for example, still exists in the movie, even if his Force Ghost was replaced with Hayden Christensen, a bunch of other actors do not. I accept that changing Boba Fett's voice was a necessary change for continuity's sake, but I mean, wouldn't it have been better to give the original voice actor a new role in the prequel trilogy, or at least preserve their existence? I know with George Hall, he was an old-ass man and probably couldn't be recast, especially since he was dead by the time Crystal Skull came out. But my solution to that is to do what Marvel films did after Stan Lee passed away. Make a direct Easter egg that references him. Maybe George Lucas didn't realize this at the time, but if you're going to phase out an actor's performance, you could at the very least acknowledge their existence in the new, updated version. The same could apply to other people who worked on the films. So with that being said, that's how I would criticize the way he made special editions on a lot of things. Aside from that, he was perfectly in the right to update his movies. He made them after all, so as such, let's talk about his character. George Lucas is commonly described as an okay guy in real life, and in any stories I've read about people who met him, the worst I could find is that he was kind of awkward to interact with. However, that is not good enough to say he's a dick. So with that short section aside, another problem I have is how he sold Star Wars to Disney. His judgment was really bad when he put Kathleen Kennedy in charge, because she proceeded to turn Star Wars into her very own whorehouse. I say this because Spielberg is quoted as saying that KKK always had horrible ideas for all the iconic movies during production. In Raiders, for example, KKK was against having Indiana Jones get the girl, and her reasons were really stupid. She was commonly laughed off for her stupid suggestions, and look at what happened when she got to control the 5th Indy movie. She tried to make it the pilot episode for a character that most of everyone hated. I also don't know what George Lucas was expecting handing Star Wars to Disney, since Disney used Star Wars and Marvel to become a monopoly, more or less, in the film industry, making low-quality products because they know they'll make a profit with at least one of the dog shit turds that they make. The problem isn't him deciding to retire. The problem is his poor judgment relating to how he retired. It seems to me like the better idea in hindsight is to hand the keys to someone while he is retired, and if they screw up his brand, he demotes or fires them, and gives the keys to someone new, and repeat the cycle until he can get someone he can trust before he dies. Now that I think about it, I don't know why he sold Star Wars to Disney specifically. It was a really bad decision. Maybe it had something to do with George Lucas seeing Bob Iger as his friend. But look where that ended up. It really seems in the years before his retirement, he made a lot of bad choices. But there were a lot of misguided choices beforehand. Now this is analyzing Grey. So obviously I don't dislike George Lucas. He's a visionary after all, and he gave us Star Wars and Indiana Jones, so he is literally the god of both IPs, and a lot of reasons people did hate George Lucas were inaccurate or incorrect. George Lucas is many things, but a hack is not one of them. He is prone to backtracking and retcons, however. For the most part, it's due to a lot of pressure being applied to him, but on the other hand, there were some cases that were not, and he did of his own accord. So to sum everything up, George Lucas deserves at least some flack for how he handled his retirement and his selling of Star Wars, but they aren't any of the stereotypical George Lucas hater reasons. George is an okay guy who had a vision that a lot of people misinterpreted and confused perception with reality. But that never ever fell on George, because he had a different idea than you. Regardless, he is the prime example of Grey. Thank you for listening to this episode of Analyzing Grey. What do you think of George Lucas? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I'm JJ Plagiarisms, and until next time, what are stories but mystery boxes?
Under the mountain, a golden fountain. Were you praying that the Loris struck?